All right, hello everybody. Thanks for joining today's brown bag presentation with Ghenis. I'll introduce our wonderful speaker in a few minutes, but I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Carrie Boyle. I work here at the Coastal Conservancy. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Coastal Conservancy is a state agency that was established in 1976 to protect and improve natural lands and waterways, help people access and enjoy the outdoors, and sustain local economies along the length of California's coast and around San Francisco Bay. And here at the Conservancy, we arrange brown bag presentations on various topics of interest for our staff, and we like to invite external partners to join as well. So thank you for those of you who are joining us both here in Oakland and on our webinar online. So we have a good number of people joining us online, and we're glad you can join. Please keep in mind that this is a lunchtime presentation, so us folks here in the room will do our best to minimize background noise for you. And for those of you in the room, thanks for joining us. You will need a badge to access the restroom, so if you ever do need to use the bathroom at any point, you'll head back to the reception, pick up a badge there, head out towards the elevators, and then make 2 right turns to access those bathrooms. Alex has an interactive presentation planned for today. We will also have time for questions at the end. So if you're in the room with us here today, please just be sure to speak up so that folks on the phone will be able to hear you, and we'll do our best to repeat those questions for folks joining on the phone. And if you're a webinar attendee and you have a question or a comment, please submit both types of those into the questions box. Unfortunately, the GoToWebinar software doesn't allow other attendees to view your questions or comments, but we'll do our best to share comments with the audience as they come in. So please keep in mind that any comments that you do submit might be shared with the rest of webinar attendees. All right, so today we're very happy to hear from Ghenis, who is a policy and research specialist at the World Institute on Disability in Berkeley. And 6 years ago, he started the New Earth Disability Initiative, which explores how people with disabilities will be affected by climate change and other environmental factors. And we're lucky to hear his perspective today. So with that, I will hand it off to you.
Cool, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you, everybody online, also for watching the webinar, or if it's after today, the recording, because this will be made available, and please feel free to share it. We'd love to have, hopefully this will open some minds. So, as Carrie mentioned, my name is Ghenis. I work at the World Institute on Disability. We're right down the street in Berkeley over at the Ed Roberts campus. A lot of people don't know, but Berkeley is the home of the modern disability rights movement. It's really known as that. And a lot of people fought for independent living because if you go back decades and decades, people with disabilities were largely locked up in institutions, not allowed to gain employment, not allowed to really manage their own lives. And what our team, what kind of our disability activists fought for is just independence and activity and safety in the world. And we'll talk a little bit about how that fits in with the environment, because we certainly are in a changing world right now. So can we go to the next slide? So a little bit about us is at the World Institute on Disability, we have over 35 years of experience in disability research, education, and policy. We do this through a bunch of different ways. Some of it is direct consulting. A lot of it is public education, developing materials, doing webinars such as this, and really trying to spread the word. We work with a lot of different partners, and thank you again to the Coastal Conservancy for bringing us out here and being so interested in our work. What the last 2 bullets right here and why this is important is my colleague Tom was on the Red Cross Disability Advisory Council, and we've been presenting on how to support people with disabilities during natural disasters for a very long time. About 6 years ago, I actually came over from the renewables field, and for me that was, I have a power wheelchair, and I want to make sure that I can charge it at night even if we're all operating on solar. And working in solar, in energy storage and the rest of that made me realize kind of how reliant I am on the system, the built environment, the electrical system, the modern kind of medical and other economic factors. And moving from that then over to WID, seeing disaster prep being so important, then got woven into, hey, it's more than just energy and natural disasters that we're facing. Climate change and what our future is going to radically transform the entire world. And people with disabilities like myself, with other types of disabilities, are much more vulnerable and are going to be impacted in very dramatic ways as the world transforms. So that's this New Earth Disability Initiative, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So people with disabilities, as I mentioned before, have to fight for a lot of necessary supports to have a good life. People with disabilities, you know, a lot of folks are kind of gung-ho, hey, I can be independent, but from my perspective, you know, everybody needs some sort of support, whether they have a disability or they're able-bodied, and people with disabilities just require, you know, different types of supports to have vibrant lives. So that could be medical supports, which would be quality health care, medical equipment, medical supplies, medication, life quality resources such as personal assistance. You know, I have some folks that come to my home and help me out during the day, and even some colleagues will help me unpack a lunch or whatever that might be. Accessible housing is incredibly important, especially as, you know, housing might be affected by climate change related factors, and as we all know, paying rent or mortgages here in the Bay Area, housing isn't cheap. I saw some eyes widen out in the audience right here. Transportation, I took BART to get here, but the elevators are down every now and then. Employment and employment accommodations, you know, there's a lot that needs to be tweaked and needs to be made accessible for people with disabilities. Funding and stability for all of this is incredibly important for social services. If somebody experiences a lapse in care for all of a couple of days, that can land them in the hospital and really impact their overall health, even survival. So when we live in a world that is getting to be a little bit more bumpy, so to speak, that any disruptions to the system as is, you know, if there's a natural disaster and somebody's personal attendant can't make it to work and they're in bed and they get a health consequence, that's a climate-related factor that we care about, and that I'll talk about a little bit more in the future. The same thing with community and family support, et cetera. And it takes time and effort to develop. I'll talk about the disability rights movement and how long it took to develop, but it's fragile. I mean, this is just social structures in general, right? And these are the ones that we care about. Next slide. So with the disability rights movement, this is something that really started in the 60s and moved all the way until today, and is still continues to move forward. Sorry. It started with the independent living and the development of independent living and disability rights philosophy, which really began up the street in Berkeley in the 1960s with Ed Roberts, who right here had post-polio and said, I want to go to school, I want to go to UC Berkeley. I know people are ringing in, this is important. I want to go to school, I want to go to Cal, and I need to not be living in, you know, an institution, in a nursing home, in a hospital to do so. And Ed, with a bunch of other folks that nicknamed themselves the Rolling Quads, fought for access to the university and a whole personal care support system over there that then grew outside of Berkeley. Went to federal legislation, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. People have fought for access to employment, for assistive technology that has made that all available. For example, myself, I use voice dictation software in order to write at work, and I can operate with a laptop, you know, plenty quickly compared to colleagues who can type. So these sorts of technologies and access to employment, and then of course overcoming discrimination and other issues that appear in the job sphere. All of that is, you know, a comprehensive sort of advocacy that our community has done. It took creative policy and political action. It took a very, very long period of time to transform and implement things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which wasn't just some 1990 legislation. It was 1990 legislation followed by advocating for proper standards that go through federal agencies, followed by a bunch of lawsuits so that people actually get their stuff in order. You know, it took a lot of time. And I think actually taking a quick step back, this is what the climate advocacy community is working on and struggling with, is the time frame of the urgent problem and an urgent issue of survival and human rights versus the reality of the speed of politics and law, right? So it's something that the disability community certainly has faced, but there's been a lot of fantastic, amazing advocates that have worked. And there's always room for improvement, and people are certainly fighting that way. One of the things that we do at WID is we work on, for example, financial literacy and access to financial services so that people no longer have to only have $2,000 in the bank to keep healthcare and personal attendance support, right? There's transitions, things like specialized savings accounts that are all of a sudden now popping up, and it's just a constant process. Slide. And then we've worked to build all this up, and along comes climate change. And here are climate impacts that we've all seen, which are low-lying island atolls that are soon going to be dealing, or currently dealing with, more flooding. We're seeing it here in the Bay. Coastal Conservancy all around California is dealing with sea level rise, stronger storms and storm surges, etc. Heat waves. That was what the it was a mid-2000s heat wave in Europe that just led to 14,000 or more excess deaths. Here is Folsom Lake down on the bottom left, and the droughts that California and other areas are going to be going through, years of incredibly intense precipitation and then drought and these swings, and then the forest fires, which affect everybody. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in detail in a minute. Flood. So the impacts of climate change are what I view and a lot of other folks view as direct impacts and indirect impacts. The direct impacts are, the climatological effects, such as stronger storms, expanding drought, sea level rise and ocean acidification, more frequent and intense heat waves, and general weather pattern changes that lead to the indirect impacts. And the indirect impacts are infrastructure damage, food insecurity, poor health and mortality, economic disruptions, environmental and ecosystem instability, and then widespread migration and displacement and climate refugees. And each of these interact in very intersectional ways. Each of these impacts is different depending on location, on socioeconomic status, on ability or disability, it's really intersectional. I think one of the words that we tend to use in disability studies, and then now moving into this work, is intersectionality. Is that none of this is going to be the same for any one person, and we need to recognize the compounding, intersectional, and really dynamic factors of socioeconomic, ability, status, et cetera, and then different climate impacts, direct and indirect. Slide. So here's a quick philosophical discussion, and we can have everybody here. Anybody who has a notepad, please feel free to do a little round table and discuss with each other for a few minutes. And people online, you can either grab a friend or just bust out, a pen or something on your computer and type up your thoughts. So what I'm going to do is we have a New Earth Disability blog, which is actually what this whole project started out of. Was I started a blog and then I came to WID and I'm like, hey, can we turn this into a project? And they're like, we'll give you an unpaid fellowship and they can find some grant money. And I said, cool. And it ended up working. Woohoo, money. But one of the blogs that we did was the philosophical comparison between forms of disability frameworks and then climate change frameworks. So we'll go right here. The next one is this right here is the medical and social model of disability. And this is a cornerstone of disability philosophy, disability advocacy, and really the movement for disability rights, which is the comparison between the medical model and the social model of disability. So the medical model, kind of the TLDR, the way that I say it is, medical model is your body is broken. Social model is, everybody has different ability levels and, bodies and everything else, and society isn't accommodating it. So it's not that I can't walk upstairs, it's that there isn't a ramp or an elevator, right? That's medical model versus social model. Breaking it down more in-depth medical model right here, you have the classical framework of disability, and the social model is a challenge to that by disability scholars and social justice advocates. The medical model revolves around the ideal, pristine, able-bodied norm, whereas the social model says that, as I mentioned, ability is a spectrum, nobody is the same, and no body is perfect. Medical model says the world is built for the norm, difficulties are the disability's fault, and the social model says the world is not accessible for all abilities, disability is a social and structural construction. Medical says disability is damage, undesirable, shunned, and punished. I was on a panel about relationships and reproductive health and things like that yesterday, and there was someone who had childhood rheumatoid arthritis, and when she was younger, a doctor recommended that she be sterilized because you don't want to pass on disability downward through society. I mean, this is the kind of eugenic ideology and philosophy that really has permeated and been an issue in the disability sphere, and it's something that is incredibly damaging. But the social model, on the other hand, says disability is a proud characteristic that should be accepted and included. A medical model says, in the worst case, it's a curse with religious implications and vilification. People, if you go back centuries, were really shunned and just viewed as, some sort of curse had been put on them or their family. Social model says that certainly is not any sort of punishment by a deity. Medical model says that disability must be cured through medical interventions, scientific solutions, medical devices, etc., that bring a person with a disability who is automatically a medicalized patient back to the able-bodied norm. The social model, on the other hand, says you fix disability not by fixing people, but by fixing the inaccessibility of the world, by making the world accessible through services, technology, accommodations, etc. And people with disabilities, some of my friends will kind of shun medicine as a visceral reaction to the negative impact that the medical model has had on their lives. I say actually you kind of do need to go to the doctor every now and then and recognize that health is important. So medicine is there for supporting health. Now I'm going to go forward one slide and then jump back to this one. But here is the little round table thing. Feel free to kind of draw the two columns. Think about this as the mitigation model of climate change versus the adaptation model of climate change, right? Which is mitigation is we need to go to net zero and eventually start sequestering more carbon than we're putting out into the atmosphere and just stop this thing in its tracks. And the adaptation model is we should try to mitigate emissions as much as possible, but we need to start adapting and we need to start preparing, building resilience, and then what I'll talk about here in a few minutes is do that recognizing those intersectional dynamics of accessible and socioeconomically equitable adaptation. So here we've got, 6 rows and 2 columns. So everyone want to kind of pair up or team up and see how you can compare these? Can we go back one slide? All right. So we'll give a 5-minute break or so right here.
I have paper.
So I think we're going to circle back. Anybody have a?
Well, it goes back to like a crunch.
Say hi to the table in the back.
Okay.
Hey, everyone. So okay, I've got the revised table right here. We can go forward in a couple of slides, but can we just go forward one slide?
Yeah.
So, what ideas did folks come up with? Anything? Yeah.
One was hardscaping or more like armoring of the shoreline as opposed to like a living shoreline.
Okay. So, which would be mitigation and which would be?
Hardscaping.
Hardscaping is mitigation.
Adaptation would be a living, something that isn't as thick.
Okay. So, actually, I would say that both are adaptations. One, because what happens with that is that both are recognizing that the ocean is going to rise, right? And you're adapting to how the ocean is going to rise. So, but that's important too, because I think one of the things that comes up with the social model of disability is that there is often so much of kind of a mechanical construction that's viewed as a solution as opposed to a more kind of dynamic, almost quote unquote natural feeling solution, right? And that's important because then in adaptation to climate change, we can view things in the built environment versus working more kind of in path with nature. And then a living shoreline will sequester carbon, so you're kind of, as us vegans say, feeding two birds with one scone. I saw that somewhere, I was like, yeah. So, okay, what else do we have? And let's go back actually to, you know what, I'm looking at how much time we have right now, so I'm actually just going to go forward and kind of cheat and go through the next slide. Sorry, everybody. So the comparison that we have right here is in the mitigation model, it's a classical framework of climate change. And this is actually, I just kind of took disability, medical model, and social model and put them and tweaked the words a little bit, but it fits surprisingly well if you look at this. So, oh wait. So, yeah, mitigation model is the classical framework of climate change, which is we are warming the climate, we need to go back. It revolves around the ideal, pristine, pre-industrial norm, which is, again, like with the disability, it involves around the able-bodied perfect norm. The world developed for 270 parts per million, and difficulties are CO2's fault. Whereas, you know, medical model says the world developed for able-bodied folks, and any difficulties are the disability's fault. Adaptation model on the other side is a challenge by scholars and some activists. It says climate is a spectrum. No era is the same, and none is perfect. We're certainly going toward one that's scary, right? But that the world has these flows of climate. We have thrown them out of whack, but we need to have a dynamic, adaptable world that we're building around. The world grew assuming stability. The danger is that is when we don't have any flexibility or preparation. Then on the left here, mitigation model says that warming is damage, undesirable, shunned, and punished. Adaptation says warming is here and progressing. Figure out how to breathe and accept it. And it should be accepted and addressed. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try for mitigation, but we need to figure out how to emotionally, culturally, economically, industrially adapt to all of this. Mitigation model, in the worst case, is holy punishment for greed and environmental harm. Adaptation is this isn't a God's punishment, so that kind of fits in with disability. Finally, mitigation model says warming must be cured through technological interventions, mitigation, sequestration, et cetera, that bring Earth back to safety. Whereas the adaptation model says avoid climate chaos by adapting through disaster prep, water use, international agreements, and more. And mitigation helps, but it isn't a cure-all. So let's go to the next slide. Why adaptation is so vital but neglected is that preparing for climate change is very important. It saves lives, well-being, economies, and more. there's two major steps which are creating general resiliency, and a couple of them are physical and economic infrastructures, social systems and support networks, then situation-focused planning, which would be, for example, disaster readiness and response, resource management, and internal and international migration, which is, the UN is saying up to 1 billion climate migrants by, mid-century, under the worst, scenarios. These are really kind of sobering numbers. We need to start early, provide resources, plan ahead, and next, practice adaptive climate justice. And this applies for disability, and this applies for all sorts of other marginalized groups. It says that oppressed and marginalized groups will be hit hardest and supported least and have the fewest personal resources available to adapt and prepare at the individual or even communal levels. Even when you've got oppressed communities that still kind of have some cohesion, but they're oppressed and under-resourced, that's an issue. So developing countries in the global south, economically disempowered and poor individuals, people of color and religious or ethnic minorities, people with disabilities are up there, but we're surprisingly left out of a whole lot of the long list of, quote, marginalized groups that we see in lists of policy and other research papers. Adaptive climate justice says that we need to, number one, address the root causes of vulnerability, which is address social and other structural inequities first in general. Try to bring everybody up to the same level playing field, and then as we are all kind of as a huge society, everybody in the world going through climate resilience and adaptation, it's good that people are kind of getting off on the same foot. Prepare with specific focus on vulnerable groups that have that are under-resourced or need specific supports, and provide resources using an equity framework. Have people seen the commercial of equality versus equity? Are people familiar with that? Okay, I didn't put it in here, but it's you've got three folks up at a fence, and there's a really tall person, like an average person and a short person, and the tall person can kind of almost see above the fence, and the short person is like, equality is you give everybody the same size block, and the tall person can see way over the fence, the average height person can see over the fence, and the short person is still looking straight into the fence. Equity is you give the tall person a really short block, just enough for them to see, the middle height person a block that's enough for them to see, and then the shorter person a much higher block, so that everybody then is able to see over the fence. It's the same thing when we're addressing adaptive climate justice. So next slide. So I've kind of touched on this, but you might be asking, what's the environment have to do with disability? Well, here we go. First of all, climate change leads to more disability. This is the focus of most policy and research papers and public health papers, as they mention something called disability-adjusted life years as a attempted quantification of the public health impact of various climate change consequences, right? So dailies is really kind of a problem from a disability rights standpoint, because it's like, oh, if you have a significant level of paralysis for 1 year, that's kind of worth half of a life, right? And that's the way that they attempt to quantify things. I'm seeing some wide eyes in the audience. But they say, okay, this climate change impact, it's not going to lead to 500 immediate deaths, and then we quantify it that way. It's that climate change by its nature is a slow and gradual just confluence of consequences, right? So that when you say, how do you put into a number the fact that climate change is going to lead to significant health consequences, and how do you compare that to a single value of a single life? That's where we see disability in most papers. I find it a big problem. A lot of people with disabilities find it as a big problem, but there hasn't been much of an alternative put forward to quantify the public health impact. The reality is that increased dailies have many causes, including storm-related injuries, crop shortages and malnutrition, invasive diseases, climate-related conflict and war injuries, and more. Next. And by the way, there's secondary dailies that will come from like a coal-fired power plant, right? Also having particulate matter pollution and other carcinogenic compounds that go and increase health consequences. So the major impacts on people with disabilities, if we want to break them down, are from storms and natural disasters. You might have inaccessible shelters and evacuation methods, fragile support systems around medical caregivers, et cetera, where people get separated during and immediately after a disaster from their necessary support systems. I know some people with disabilities where they've been with the same specialist physician for years of their life. That person knows their health inside and out. If that person all of a sudden dies in a storm, then that's part of the social network, and that will impact the person with a disability. It's a really dynamic world that we live in. So for heat waves, increased chance of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. With my disability, a high-level spinal cord injury, I can actually sweat to cool myself down. It's just like I don't have that thermal regulation issue. Somebody with diabetes will have a really hard time with extreme heat. So if we have more heat waves, that'll affect us. Different types of disabilities, and then people with disabilities have higher rates of poverty, live in substandard housing, and might have less access to air conditioning, either like an actual air conditioning unit or the money to pay a heightened AC bill when you've got a lot of heat waves going on. Displacement and migration, people care about accessible transit and housing, portable government, medical, and personal care supports. Within the U.S., there's some new legislation that's starting to go through, especially in the wake of some of the recent hurricanes, where they're talking about speeding up Medicaid portability in the wake of an emergency declaration or natural disaster, because Medicaid is state by state. So if you're in Florida and you get hit by a hurricane and all of a sudden need to go up to Alabama or Georgia or out to wherever else you get displaced to, not only will you not have access to your original physician, you might not have access to the healthcare to pay the bills. And we're trying to figure that out in the United States in a big way. Economic effects, people with disabilities already have low unemployment, relatively low income levels, and high poverty. So any sort of economic effects are going to hit economically marginalized people first, or more dramatically. And then if there's any sort of government services that get jeopardized, that's an issue, and that could be the economic shutdown of the government, or when just budgets get tight. And we've seen this, especially under certain administrations or congressional groups, that they'll go after social services first. Climate change is more than just a few more storms. It really affects the entire economy, and this will hit the disability community and population. Next. So a key example here, natural disasters. So we've got the campfire up top, and then the Oroville Dam spillway at the bottom. Out of the 80 some odd people that died in the campfire, the majority were folks that were elderly or people with disabilities. They might not have access to transportation. I and a whole bunch of other people with disabilities that I know, we don't own our own personal vehicles. We use public transit. People use paratransit, and paratransit sure as hell isn't going to drive their vehicle out in the middle of a fire, especially when this is a system where you've already got to call a day in advance and they give you a 2-hour window, right? So evacuation is something that's really important. It's something that we care about at WID. We're working on a project on this, and it's daunting. It really is. The Oroville Dam disaster, that there were some people that we heard anecdotes and stories of, they were pretty much stuck at home because their caregiver just booked it out of town when the entire city of, over 100,000, it was a whole lot of people that had to evacuate Oroville. And then, some people were left behind, lost access to caregivers, and it was an incredibly stressful few weeks as they were figuring out this spillway back in 2017. Next slide. So what we care about in terms of addressing these is we want better communication for sensory disabilities. So storm warnings on TV, for example, we need closed captioning when that goes up. That announcements in shelters should have closed captioning or interpreters or other access. At our organization, we work alongside Department of Social Services and then the Red Cross in order to train individuals that are going into Red Cross shelters on how to support people with disabilities, and communication for people with sensory disabilities is incredibly important. For evacuation, having accessible buses and operational paratransit or any other sort of way to help people evacuate is important. Having mass evacuations of nursing homes. Now, this is stuff that's tough enough if we are looking at there's a hurricane that's 3 days out and we need to proactively evacuate a nursing home. With things like we have in California with fast-moving wildfires, that's a whole other level, but it's things that we need. And actually, one of the things that we are talking to folks about is there's a tricky balance between what government can do and what organizations can do, and then how individuals can develop good, inclusive, comprehensive, disability accessible personal disaster plans, personal emergency and evacuation plans. And that's something where people with disabilities have just got to get to know their neighbors. They've got to get to know, who has a car, and say to a neighbor, I know this is weird, but if there's a fire, can you come knock on my door? I give you the thumbs up to just break that thing down with your shoulder and come inside and find someone that can help carry me into your back of your car seat. We'll find a wheelchair somewhere else when we get out of town. I mean, these are like the personal emergency evacuations that people really need to focus on and get put together. Then finally, within shelters, having fully accessible shelters with medical support. We always advocate for universally accessible systems, period, where we want integration. Anything that is federally funded under that Section 504 has to have a certain amount of universal integration components to it, and we really advocate for that within general population shelters as opposed to separating people with disabilities all out into medicalized special needs shelters. But either way, as long as, we just want to make sure that people are able to get the services that they need and be in a healthy space after a disaster. And finally, recovery, which this is longer term, is finding housing and employment, especially when people with disabilities, the reality is that we've got fewer job prospects depending on our level of education and, ability and what it might be. I can do a desk job just fine. I'm not going to do construction, right? If there's something that happens in Berkeley, I'm going to have fewer job opportunities outside of my immediate area when I'm going to find new jobs. So we need just good housing, universally accessible housing, period, and then better employment opportunities for everybody. Next slide. This here is where I think that State Coastal Conservancy comes in a lot, which is the value of recreation and access to nature. Both of them support vibrant living and is just kind of human rights. That's that last bullet point. But it supports emotional, psychological, and spiritual health. It builds social connections and strength. It inspires ecologically sound habits. I think people get out to the beach and they're a little bit less likely to go polluting all over the place, or really you see a beautiful beach and then all of a sudden you hear about an oil spill, and that becomes a little bit more personal, and you care about preventing those oil spills because you've seen how pristine that beach is firsthand, right? It supports ecologically sound living habits. One of the things that we have supported and we are a part of is called the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. And transformational resilience is, it's a really complete, they call it psychosocial, spiritual resilience in the face of climate change, which is like, how many people have damn near gone to bed crying just thinking about climate change before? So there's some, there's some laughs, but it's a reality. People that are aware of what's going on, it's really difficult to process it emotionally. And anything that we can do as a society to support each other through community, through mutual support, through mutual emotional support and logistical support, but also having things that are just spiritually and emotionally healing, like getting out into nature, that's a way, that's climate adaptation right there, right? Individual, emotional, and social and spiritual health is really valuable, and it's part of a human right. So that's something where, talking to Carrie about all the work that the Coastal Conservancy is doing, that it's fantastic that there's an effort within this organization and your allies to ensure that public spaces are accessible to people with disabilities. And so, like, y'all are doing great work on that front, and thank you. Next slide. So here's Machu Picchu. This is a little example because Machu Picchu was finally, made accessible in 2017 by my buddy Alvaro right there, who came up with this, like, you know, unicycle with a couple of handles in front of him, behind him, and is now, you know, working with a couple of tour guides to do trips for people with disabilities up to Machu Picchu. But these are sorts of connections with, you know, ancient civilizations and nature and the rest of it, that now we've got cool beach wheelchairs, like Alvaro came up with this little device and whatever else it is, that people with disabilities are able to get out into nature a little bit more, and it's valuable to support that. So what to do? As you point a green arrow at the speaker. Next slide. So what to do is, things to do are to, first of all, build resilience. I'm going to take a quick pause really quickly, and like have a voice crack like when I was 16, when I'm talking about disability, I think it's important for us to realize disability is not just like me here in this wheelchair, right? Where I have a spinal cord injury that was an acquired disability. It's that people have disabilities from birth. Some of them are chronic health conditions. Some of them are sensory disabilities where you've got blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing. You might have a learning disability, intellectual and developmental disability, psychological disability, emotional disability, anything along those lines. And each of these, there are different medical, personal, logistical, et cetera, supports that help to even the playing field for people with disabilities. And that's why, going back several slides when I said you want general resilience, but you've got to address it, you know, marginalized community by marginalized community, and sometimes on the individual level. And that's really important when we're talking about climate adaptation and resilience for people with disabilities. Is we want universal access wherever possible, but there's got to be a certain amount of individual planning and support, or at least development of resources that are specific to different types of disabilities. You know, if we create a beach access guide or we create a disaster readiness guide, there should be a section on sensory disabilities, a section on, emotional disabilities, psychological disabilities, physical disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's important. So from building resilience is in logistical, is you've got adaptive climate justice and use that as the overarching framework. Do complete planning and focus on all impacts and disabilities, and use the adaptation framework. Like, I love what everybody's doing in terms of trying to cut down carbon emissions and hopefully get to net zero. There needs to be a whole lot more about investing our resources in locking down for what's already happening and what's on the way, and doing it using the precautionary principle. So we need to do that with building resilience, using the precautionary principle, and bringing in marginalized communities, and from our perspective, people with disabilities. Have social and political resilience, so that's cohesion and mutual support. Prevent stress and conflict. Have psychological, emotional, and spiritual resilience, which is what I was talking about earlier, individual coping strategies, social support and cohesion, and access to peaceful healing spaces. Something that's difficult is the psychological approach to climate change. Like, one of the first reactions is deny that this is happening because it's way too scary to process, right? And humans, the way that we're designed is to care about immediate, survival and gratification to a certain extent, right? This is like how we, evolved and programmed over millennia. And the long-term and really, like, emotionally overwhelming thing that is climate change, that's tough to process. So we need to support each other with accepting this, with having good community, and then with adapting appropriately. Next slide. So recreation and access to nature. On the left here, so on the right here is like a really awesome hand cycle for I think this is someone who's an amputee who can just go super fast on this hand cycle. For me, this this power wheelchair is good enough that I can get around some of the like better smoothness dirt trails up in the hills around, but having something that's smoother paved and well maintained is really important as well. And then there's adaptive equipment such as these beach wheelchairs over here on the left were supported through a grant funding opportunity through the Coastal Conservancy. So thank you again for opening up access to nature and recreation. And then we all need to go and educate, first of all, just about disability rights, and then second about climate change. Slide. So make sure that we have tailored information and outreach. I don't give the same talk to every single organization, right? And I think that within different communities and within different allies, or trying to convince the minds of people that aren't allies, we really need to make sure that we have good talking points that we can address to different communities and stakeholders. Within the disability issue, we care about all of these different topics like disability rights, environmental justice, climate resilience, and public health. We want to make sure that as we educate, and that, for example, as your organizations and everybody that's online, as you're putting things out, that you try to create through accessible media. One of the things that comes to mind is on Word documents. Every time that there's an image, right-click that, select Alt Text, and then type in a quick description of what that picture might be, and do that on every single Word document and every single PDF that you end up putting out, because that makes it so that somebody who is blind or really low vision and uses screen reading, text software or text-to-speech software, that they can have a full kind of understanding of what's there on the page. From the disability rights, we have the saying, nothing about us without us. So as you're going to try to increase accessibility, reach out to organizations, advocates, experts with disabilities, and try to bring them in. And don't even necessarily bring, you can, but there's people with disabilities in every community. We're 15% of the global population, some sort of disability, and some people hone that disability identity, others kind of shove it aside, but try to make sure that everybody's included. Speak their language and be solution focused. Next. Then we need to coordinate efforts. One of the things is that disability reforms are beneficial regardless. As I said, we've been working for decades to improve disability access, and climate resilience provides another strong argument for better access, because if we're building new housing, make it all universally accessible housing. Have some units with roll-in showers in there, because you never know when someone might be displaced by a climate change consequence, need to find new housing, and then awesome, these new buildings are beyond ADA code, where they actually all of them have automatic door openers. This is a great reason to just accelerate the amount of access that we're trying to build into society in the first place. Connect and coordinate, work with everybody, brainstorm policies, combine messages, and advocate together. This is a team effort, I think, as a lot of people here know, and hopefully people online too. Here in California, kind of a final closing thought is that we have California Executive Order B3015, which was signed in 2015. It sets a greenhouse gas target of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. It creates the Safeguarding California Adaptation Plan every 3 years. And then it says that the state's 5-year infrastructure plan will take current and future climate change impacts into account in all infrastructure projects. And this last one, which is what we care about, one of the things that we care about is that action should protect the state's most vulnerable populations, and disability absolutely needs to be in all state actions. Slide. Here's a couple of things that we can look at and just ponder as you're leaving today or looking at this webinar or the slides about how disability could be integrated into these. So social systems in the built environment, you've got emergency management, energy. As I said, I need to be able to charge my wheelchair, and people with ventilators need access to ventilators, right? Land use and community development, public health and transportation, and then natural and managed resource systems. We've got agriculture, biodiversity and habitat, forests, ocean and coasts, and water. I'm short on time, otherwise I'm sure I could talk about these all day, but just ponder them based off of what you've seen today too. So, next slide. And then finally, the next steps are understand your area and your organizations and your allies' efforts at climate resilience, recreation, and access to nature. Identify opportunities for disability inclusion in planning and development. Articulate the need for research, policies, implementation, and related funding. Raise your hand in a meeting and say, hey, I didn't hear this discussed. I mean, we can all be advocates. I think that there's things that are in the back of a lot of people's minds, and they just need to be said, and then that can be turned into action, right? Secure buy-in, bring in partners as needed, and then develop a plan for actions, timeframes, and resource needs. So it's easy to, as I know in the nonprofit world, it's easy to write a grant application, and then that 2-year project building a 50-page report is a whole other deal, but that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we put together all of the long-term plans and bring everybody together to make it happen. And collaborate. So I think the next slide. Okay, so this is me. We've got 5 minutes for questions. Does anybody have questions, feedback? Anybody online? We got a hand in the back. Yeah. So this might be a difficult question to answer, but given the fact that you've been doing this research and you have some specialized expertise in this, what segment of the disabled communities is least, given attention to? Which subset of that population do you think gets the least attention? The one that comes to mind is a huge percentage of the homeless population has disabilities, and I think psychological disabilities is really easily abandoned and shoved aside and dehumanized. So, in terms of basic survival, like resources, someone with, I think, a significant physical disability or chronic health condition, that's something that definitely needs to be taken into account. I'm concerned about people in Sacramento are concerned about what's going to be happening with the major utilities starting to do more proactive power shutoffs during high fire risk moments. And I went and bought a battery pack and a small solar charger, right? And that's for me where I just want to make sure that I can charge my wheelchair, but I don't have a ventilator, or, I know a lot of people where they need uninterrupted power for survival. So that's something that we've got to figure out, and that's really important too. Yeah. But I would say homeless population and, psychological disabilities is really kind of discounted and shoved aside, unfortunately. Is there a question? We got one behind you too.
Yeah, we have one online. So Victoria is wondering, she works at an outdoor adventure nonprofit organization that serves girls aged 11 through 18. How do you recommend we begin to look at making space for youth with disabilities? Our activities mainly focus on camping, hiking, climbing, and kayaking.
Reach out to, so there's an organization, the Bay Area Outreach and Recreation Program. So I think that's just BORP.org, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah? Okay, yeah, so BORP.org. They're fantastic, and they can give a lot of advice. I mean, it's not like a national, it's just, those are our friends and allies over here in the Bay that seem to have gotten a lot of good stuff together, so maybe pick their brain. Yeah.
So we're grant managers, and we do a lot of grants to cities and counties and other organizations for climate adaptation, and a lot of folks are kind of just starting out in climate adaptation, and we have some grant rounds like that coming up soon, and we provide technical assistance. What's some advice that we could give our grantees, like cities and counties throughout California, about how to make sure that people with disabilities are considered in adaptation plans?
Yeah. So what? Gosh, this
Probably a super short
Big
answer.
question.
Yeah, I know. So I'll keep it short. Ask them to articulate what they're going to do, and that'll get their brain going. So I think that, you say, in a lot of grants, there's how will this, affect marginalized communities, and you could consider adding a specific question about, how will you support people with disabilities? How will your adaptation plans be made fully accessible, et cetera? Either use that as a way to get them thinking and hopefully just write it in, or if you, really want to, then make it a component of the grading and scoring rubric for distributing funds. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, what advice would you give to people with disabilities who want to increase personal resilience in the face of climate change? Like, what resources, are there any resources out there with information about steps to take? I mean, I think making sure local government is doing what they can is important, but in the meantime, like, what resources exist out there for people?
Yeah, well, you know what, this link at the bottom, the question was what resources are available for individuals with disabilities on their own personal preparedness plans. I would say our website right here, wid.org/NED, that's the World Institute on Disability.org/New Earth Disability. Wid.org/climate will also take you there. We've got links to resources, and developing a personal disaster preparedness plan is really valuable. And then also figuring out how to be an advocate. It's part of disability is admitting disability-related needs and vulnerabilities, and then figuring out how to manage your life around that. So I think that a lot of people with disabilities, might just have a little bit too much pride and not, and that'll block them from really developing like a good comprehensive disability inclusive disaster preparedness plan. So part of it is just saying, you know what, whatever my disaster preparedness plan is, I've got to make sure that I have that 1, 2, or 3 weeks of medication, right? And it's daunting, it's overwhelming to think about, but people need to do that, yeah. But yeah, our website has a good amount of info. Some of it's links to other people, but yeah. Any others? I know we're right about time, right?
Yeah, and I'm not seeing any questions come up on the webinar, so Alex will probably be able to hang out for a little bit if folks have more questions.
Yeah, I'll hang out for a few. For anybody online or you all, feel free to email me or, do the phone call or whatever. I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex.